Sometimes a man's final choice reveals everything about who he truly is. Sometimes that choice comes when you least expect it, in a place where mercy has long since packed up and left town. In Dead Mare Crossing, they dragged Ashgar Vane into a makeshift courtroom for trespassing on railroad land. The judge offered him a simple deal: choose a bride before sunset or hang. The whole room laughed, thinking they were about to watch some desperate theater. But this weathered mountain man had other ideas. When he pointed to Calla Rue, the homeless girl sitting alone in the corner, nobody was laughing anymore. She had nothing to offer him. No money, no family, no reason for any man to choose her. Yet something in that moment changed everything for both of them. What makes a stranger worth saving your own life for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before that fateful moment in the courthouse, Ashgar Vane had descended from the high country, with winter's bite already sharpening the morning air. His pack horse carried the usual load: pelts to trade, a small pouch of gold dust, and a list written in his careful script of supplies needed before the snows locked him away for another season. He'd made this journey to Dead Mare Crossing twice yearly for the past decade, and each time the town had grown a little larger, a little louder, and a lot more desperate. The railroad had arrived 3 years ago like a steel serpent cutting through the valley, bringing with it men who spoke of progress and prosperity, but left behind broken promises and displaced families. What had once been a simple trading post, where mountain men, trappers, and the occasional rancher could conduct honest business, had transformed into something uglier. Corporate money had a way of corrupting everything it touched, and Dead Mare Crossing bore the stains of that corruption in every hastily erected building and every family living in makeshift camps beyond the town limits. Ashgar guided his horses down the winding trail that led into the valley, his weathered hands steady on the reins, despite his 62 years. The mountains had been kind to him, keeping his body strong and his mind sharp, though they'd also carved deep lines around his grey eyes and left his dark hair streaked with silver. He wore his years like the leather of his well-maintained saddle, worn but dependable, marked by use but far from finished. The town spread before him like a wound in the earth. Where once there had been perhaps a dozen buildings arranged around a central square, now there were 3 times that many, most thrown up with green lumber and poor craftsmanship. The railroad depot dominated the eastern end of town, its red brick facade an alien presence among the weathered wood structures. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the sound of hammering echoed from several construction sites where men worked to expand the commercial district. But it was the people that caught Ashgar's attention most. Not the merchants and railroad workers who moved with purpose and coin in their pockets, but the others, the families camped in wagons at the town's edges, the men who stood in groups near the saloon with the hollow look of those who'd lost everything, the women who clutched children close while scanning the streets with wary eyes. These were the displaced, the ones who'd sold their land to the railroad for promises that never materialized, or worse, had simply been driven off by legal technicalities and corporate pressure. Among them, barely visible unless you knew how to look, were the truly forgotten ones. The drifters, the broken, the ones who'd fallen through whatever cracks society bothered to maintain. Ashgar had learned to see them during his years of isolation, perhaps because he recognized something of himself in their careful invisibility. He made his way to McCready's General Store, the one establishment that hadn't changed hands when the railroad money started flowing. Old Pete McCready had been trading with mountain men since before Ashgar was born, and his store remained a refuge of honest dealing in a town increasingly ruled by graft and manipulation. "Ashgar Vane," Pete called out as the bell above his door announced the visitor. "Figured I'd see you before the first real snow. You're cutting it close this year. Weather's holding longer than usual," Ashgar replied, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Might get another 2 weeks of decent traveling." Pete nodded toward the list Ashgar placed on the counter. "The usual supplies, I imagine. Coffee, salt, ammunition. Though I should warn you, Prices have gone up again. Railroad companies been putting pressure on suppliers. Something about ensuring the economic stability of the region. The older man's voice carried the weight of disgust. As Pete gathered the requested items, Ashgar let his gaze wander around the store. It was then he noticed her, sitting on a wooden crate near the back corner where the shadows gathered thickest. At first glance, she might have been mistaken for a bundle of old clothes someone had left behind. But Ashgar's mountain-trained eyes caught the subtle rise and fall of breathing, the careful positioning that spoke of someone. Trying to remain unnoticed while staying warm, she was young, perhaps 20 or 21, with auburn hair that hadn't seen proper care in months and clothes that had once been decent, but now bore the stains and patches of hard living. What struck him most, though, were her eyes. They held an intelligence that poverty and hardship hadn't managed to dim, and a wariness that spoke of someone who'd learned the world's lessons the hard way. "That's Calla Rue," Pete said quietly, following Ashgar's gaze. "Been coming in here for about 3 months now. Doesn't steal, doesn't beg, just sits there quiet-like when the weather's too rough to be outside. Lost her family to claim jumpers up north, from what I can piece together. Been drifting ever since." Ashgar nodded but said nothing. He'd known that kind of loss himself, though his had come wrapped in different circumstances. The girl, Calla, caught him looking and met his gaze steadily, neither defiant nor submissive, just aware. There was strength there, he realized. The kind that bent without breaking, that found ways to survive when survival seemed impossible. "She's educated," Pete continued, keeping his voice low. "Sometimes helps Mrs. Henderson with her accounts when her arthritis is acting up. Can read and write better than most of the railroad men, from what I've seen. But education doesn't put food in your belly or a roof over your head, especially when you're a woman. Alone in a place like this, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other customers, 2 men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the particular arrogance of those who believe money grants them dominion over others. Ashgar recognized the type immediately. Railroad men, probably from the territorial offices based on their clean appearance and soft hands. "McGrady," the taller of the two said without preamble, "we need to discuss your lease agreement again." Pete's jaw tightened. "My lease is paid up through next year, Mr. Morrison, same as I told you last month." "Circumstances change," the man replied smoothly. "The railroad company is prepared to offer you very generous terms for relocation, much more generous than waiting for your lease to expire, and if I choose to honor my existing agreement." Morrison's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Well, that would be unfortunate. Building codes are becoming more stringent. Fire regulations, structural requirements. It would be a shame if your establishment was found to be non-compliant." Ashgar felt his hands tighten into fists, but he remained still. This wasn't his fight, and he'd learned long ago that sometimes the best way to help was to stay invisible until the right moment presented itself. But he filed away every word, every nuance of threat and intimidation. The railroad men left without purchasing anything, their message delivered. Pete stood behind his counter, hands shaking slightly with suppressed anger. "This is how it goes now," the storekeeper said, to no one in particular. "They buy the law, they buy the judges, they buy whatever they need to take what they want. Used to be a man's word meant something in this territory. Now it's all lawyers and contracts, and fine print that changes whenever it suits them." Ashgar completed his transaction in thoughtful silence, paying Pete's inflated prices without complaint. As he prepared to leave, he glanced once more toward the corner where Calla sat. She was watching him again, and this time he saw something else in her expression, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even hope. It was the look of someone who'd learned to recognize the difference between those who preyed and those who protected, and she'd apparently placed him in the latter category. Outside, the afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Ashgar loaded his supplies onto the pack horse and considered his options. He could camp outside town and head back to his mountain refuge in the morning, or he could spend one night at the small boarding house and leave at first light. The smart choice was to leave immediately. Every instinct developed over 40 years of mountain living told him this town was heading toward trouble, and trouble had a way of spreading to anyone nearby, but something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of Pete's shaking hands, or the quiet desperation he'd seen in too many faces, or the way that girl in the corner had looked at him with a mixture of wariness and hope. Maybe it was simply that at 62, a man started thinking more about the legacy he'd leave behind, and less about the safety he'd built around himself. He secured a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house and spent the evening in the common room, listening to conversations that painted a picture of a community under siege. Families forced to sell their land for a fraction of its value. Men arrested on trumped-up charges when they protested too loudly. A justice system that had been bought and paid for by railroad money, and presiding over it all was Judge Harlan, a man who'd arrived with the railroad and immediately appointed himself the legal authority for the territory. No one questioned his credentials or his authority, partly because he carried papers that looked official, and partly because those who questioned too loudly had a tendency to find themselves facing charges in his courtroom. As Ashgar prepared for sleep that night, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the girl in Macready's store. There had been something familiar in her situation, something that resonated with memories he usually kept buried deep. Perhaps it was simply that he recognized a fellow survivor, someone who'd learned to navigate a world that showed little mercy to the vulnerable. He had no way of knowing that within 48 hours, both their lives would be irrevocably changed by a simple act of trespassing and a judge's cruel sense of entertainment. Sometimes fate moved slowly, building pressure like water behind a dam until the inevitable moment of release. Other times it struck like lightning, illuminating everything in a single, brilliant flash that revealed the true nature of the world around you. For Ashgar Vane and Calla Rue, that lightning was about to strike. The mistake, if it could be called that, happened on his second morning in Dead Mare Crossing. Ashgar had risen before dawn, as was his custom, and walked to the edge of town to check on his horses. The animals were restless, sensing something in the air that spoke of weather changes coming sooner than expected. He decided to move them to better shelter and found what appeared to be an abandoned corral about a half-mile. Beyond the town limits, the corral sat in a natural depression where his horses would be protected from the wind. There were no signs warning against use, no indication that the land belonged to anyone in particular. In the mountains, such places were considered common ground, available to any traveler who needed temporary shelter and would leave the area as they found it. Ashgar had just finished settling his animals when the riders appeared. 6 men on horseback, led by a thin man with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest and a self-important air that immediately put Ashgar on guard. "You're trespassing on railroad property," the deputy announced without preamble. "By order of Judge Harlan, you're under arrest." Ashgar looked around the empty land, noting the surveyor's stakes that had been driven into the ground sometime during the night. Fresh dirt still clung to their bases. "These stakes weren't here when I arrived," he said calmly. "That's not for you to determine," the deputy replied. "The railroad company has clear title to this land, properly recorded and filed. You'll have to take up any disputes with the judge." The setup was obvious to anyone with half a brain, but Ashgar also understood that arguing with 6 armed men was a losing proposition. He gathered his gear and allowed himself to be escorted back to town, leading his horses behind him. A crowd had already begun to gather in the main street, drawn by the unusual sight of an arrest in progress. The courthouse was a generous term for the largest building in Dead Mare Crossing's commercial district. It had been constructed hastily from rough lumber and served as courtroom, jail, and Judge Harlan's private office. A hand-painted sign above the door declared it, "Territorial Court, Justice for All," though the irony of that motto was apparently lost on its inhabitants. Judge Harlan himself was a man of perhaps 50 years who'd clearly never missed a meal in his life. His black hair was pomaded to an unnatural shine, and his expensive suit was cut in the latest Eastern fashion. Everything about him spoke of a man who'd discovered that a few legal documents and the backing of corporate money could transform him from whatever he'd been before into a figure of authority and power. Ashgar Vane, the judge said, consulting a leather-bound ledger. Charged with trespassing on railroad company property, destruction of survey markers, and interfering with lawful commerce. I destroyed no markers, Ashgar replied evenly. And the land appeared to be unclaimed when I used it. Judge Harlan waved a dismissive hand. The railroad company has been very clear about protecting their property rights. Too many vagrants and drifters have been taking liberties with land that was purchased in good faith and properly surveyed. The courtroom, such as it was, filled with townspeople drawn by curiosity and the promise of entertainment. Ashgar recognized several faces from his visits to McCready's store, including Pete himself, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the proceedings. Near the back, almost invisible in the shadows, sat Calla Rue. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw the same wariness he'd noticed before, now mixed with something that might have been sympathy. The penalty for trespassing on railroad property, Judge Harlan continued, clearly enjoying his moment of theatrical authority, is a fine of $500 or 30 days in the territorial jail. A murmur ran through the crowd. $500 was more money than most families saw in a year. The jail, such as it was, consisted of 2 cells in the building's basement that flooded every time it rained and had already claimed the lives of 3 men who'd been unable to pay various fines. However, the judge said, raising his voice to quiet the crowd, I'm prepared to be merciful in this case. You're clearly a man of advanced years, Mr. Vane, and jail might not be appropriate for someone of your delicate constitution. Ashgar bristled at the implication but remained silent. There was something else coming, something that had put a gleam of cruel amusement in the judge's eyes. Therefore, I'm prepared to offer you an alternative sentence. You may choose a bride from among the available women of this community and enter into lawful marriage before sunset today. Your new wife will provide stability and ensure your integration into our growing community. In return, your sentence will be commuted to time served. The courtroom erupted in laughter and scattered applause. This was the kind of entertainment the townspeople had come to expect from Judge Harlan's court. Part legal proceeding, part theatrical performance. Several men called out suggestions about which women might be available, while others placed mock bets on whether the mountain man would be desperate enough to accept such terms. And if I refuse? Ashgar asked. Then you'll hang by the neck until dead, Judge Harlan replied cheerfully. Repeated trespassing is a capital offense in this territory, and I've just discovered that you've been using railroad land for your camps on previous visits. Multiple violations, you understand. The laughter in the courtroom took on a different quality, less amused, more uncertain. Even for Judge Harlan's court, execution seemed extreme for such minor charges. But no one spoke up to object. The railroad's money had bought more than just land titles. It had purchased silence and complicity from a community that had learned the cost of opposing corporate will. Ashgar looked around the room, assessing his options. The women present included the merchant's wife, clearly horrified at the prospect of being chosen by a stranger. The saloon keeper, whose calculating expression suggested she was already considering the financial advantages of such an arrangement. And several others who watched the proceedings with mixtures of curiosity, amusement, and growing discomfort. Then his gaze fell on Calla Rue. She sat perfectly still in the back corner, her hands folded in her lap, watching the entire proceeding with an expression of careful neutrality. Unlike the other women, she showed no sign of concern about being chosen, perhaps because she assumed no one would consider her a viable option. She had no money, no family connections, no social standing that would make her an attractive choice for a man trying to save his own life. But Ashgar saw something else. He saw intelligence in her steady gaze, strength in the way she held herself despite her circumstances, and a kind of quiet dignity that poverty couldn't touch. More than that, he saw someone who understood what it meant to survive against impossible odds, someone who might understand that sometimes desperate circumstances required unconventional solutions. "I choose her," he said clearly, pointing directly at Calla. The laughter in the courtroom died instantly. Every head turned to look at the girl in the corner, then back at Ashgar, then at Judge Harlan, who seemed genuinely surprised by this development. "Her?" the judge asked. "Mr. Vane, perhaps you should reconsider. Miss Rue has no property, no family, no means of support. Surely one of our more established citizens would better serve your needs." "I've made my choice," Ashgar replied firmly. For the first time since the proceedings began, Calla spoke. "And what if I refuse?" Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the suddenly silent room. Judge Harlan's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon." "You've asked him to choose a bride," Calla continued, rising from her seat with careful dignity. "But marriage requires the consent of both parties. What if I refuse to marry him?" The judge's expression darkened. "Miss Rue, you would be well advised to consider the generous opportunity being offered to you. Marriage to Mr. Vane would provide you with security and social standing you could never achieve on your own. And if I still refuse, then you'll be charged with interfering with the lawful dispensation of justice, a serious crime that carries its own penalties." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Calla looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who'd watched her struggle for months without offering help, who'd treated her as invisible until this moment when her cooperation was required for their entertainment. Finally, her gaze returned to Ashgar. He met her eyes steadily, trying to communicate something beyond words, not desperation or pleading, but a kind of respectful understanding. He was asking for her help, but he was also offering something in return. Partnership, perhaps. "Mutual survival, I accept," she said quietly. Judge Harlan clapped his hands together with renewed enthusiasm. "Excellent. The wedding will take place at sunset in this very courtroom. I'll perform the ceremony myself. Mr. Vane, Miss Rue, you have until then to prepare yourselves for this joyous occasion." As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the unexpected turn of events, Ashgar approached Calla. Up close, he could see the careful control she was maintaining, the way she held herself together through sheer force of will. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because you're the only person in this room who understands what it means to survive," he replied. "And because I suspect you're the only one who won't try to change me into something I'm not." She studied his face for a long moment. "And what do you expect from me?" "Partnership," Ashgar said. "Nothing more, nothing less. We help each other survive whatever comes next." Calla nodded slowly. "Until sunset, then." As she walked away, Ashgar realized that his simple plan to gather supplies and return to the mountains had just become something far more complicated. But looking around the courtroom at the faces of men who'd orchestrated this entire charade, he also realized that perhaps complications were exactly what the situation required. Judge Harlan was already planning his next theatrical performance, unaware that he'd just set in motion events that would ultimately lead to his own downfall. The hours between the judge's pronouncement and sunset moved with the peculiar mixture of urgency and dreamlike unreality that accompanies life-changing events. Ashgar found himself in the unusual position of preparing for a wedding he'd never intended, while trying to understand the woman who'd agreed to save his life. Calla had disappeared immediately after accepting his proposal, and for a moment he wondered if she'd simply decided to leave town rather than follow through with their arrangement. But Pete McCready found him an hour later with a message. She would meet him at the boarding house at 4 o'clock to discuss the practicalities of their situation. "She's a smart one," Pete said as they stood outside his store. "Smarter than most folks in this town give her credit for. But she's been hurt, Ashgar, hurt bad. I don't know all the details, but I've seen enough broken people to recognize the signs. Whatever happened to her family? It wasn't just claim jumpers taking their land. Ashgar nodded, filing away this information. He'd spent enough years reading the subtle signs of wildlife behavior to know that approaching a wounded creature required patience and respect for its defenses. At precisely 4 o'clock, Calla knocked on his door at the boarding house. She'd somehow managed to clean herself up in the intervening hours. Her hair was neatly braided. Her dress had been mended and brushed clean, and she carried herself with a dignity that made her earlier invisibility seem like a deliberate choice rather than a circumstance. "We need to establish some ground rules," she said without preamble, settling into the room's single chair while he remained standing by the window. "Agreed. First, this is a business arrangement. You need a wife to avoid hanging, and I need security to avoid starving. Nothing more. Understood. Second, I won't be anyone's property. I've seen what happens to women who become dependent on men who view them as possessions. Whatever this arrangement becomes, it will be between equals." Ashgar studied her face, noting the steel beneath her calm exterior. "You'll get no argument from me on that point. Third, I want to know who you really are. Not just your name, but who you were before you came to these mountains. A man doesn't survive 40 years in the wilderness without learning skills that most people never develop. And a man doesn't face a hanging with the kind of calm you showed unless he's faced worse things before." This was the moment Ashgar had hoped to avoid, at least initially. His past contained complications that could endanger anyone associated with him, and he'd spent 15 years carefully constructing a life that kept those complications buried. But looking at Calla's steady gaze, he realized that she'd already made her own deductions about his background. "You're right," he said finally. "I wasn't always a mountain man, but that past is complicated, and it might be dangerous for you to know too much. More dangerous than marrying a stranger to avoid starvation in a town controlled by corrupt railroad men." The point was well taken. Ashgar moved to the window, looking out at the street where people were already gathering for the evening's entertainment. "I was a U.S. Marshal for 23 years, he said quietly. "Specialized in cases involving territorial disputes, land fraud, and corporate corruption." He heard her sharp intake of breath, but continued without turning around. 15 years ago, I uncovered evidence of a massive fraud scheme involving railroad companies, territorial officials, and federal land grants. The corruption went all the way to Washington, involving people with enough power to make problems disappear permanently. What happened? I tried to do the right thing, gathered evidence, prepared to testify before a federal grand jury. But they got to me first, not directly, but through my family. His voice grew quieter. I had a wife and daughter then. The official story was that they died in a cholera outbreak while I was away on an investigation. But I know better. Calla was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a new understanding. "So you disappeared. I faked my own death and vanished into the mountains. It seemed like the only way to honor their memory and avoid getting anyone else killed." He turned to face her. "That's why I chose you, Calla. You're not connected to anyone who could be hurt if my past catches up with me, and you think it might. I think Judge Harlan and his railroad friends are running the same kind of operation I was investigating 15 years ago. I think today's trial was meant to flush out anyone who might cause problems for them. And I think they're going to be very interested in a mountain man who doesn't scare easily and who might know more about their business than they'd prefer." Calla absorbed this information with the same careful consideration she'd shown throughout their conversation. "So by marrying you, I'm not just avoiding starvation. I'm potentially making myself a target. Yes, and you told me this because you deserve to know what you're agreeing to. Because if we're going to be partners, it has to be based on honesty. And because I've learned that underestimating people is a good way to get yourself killed." She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "My family wasn't killed by claim jumpers, Mr. Vane. They were murdered by men working for a mining company that wanted our land. I watched from the woods where my father had sent me to gather herbs. I saw everything. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Two people who'd lost everything to corporate greed. Two survivors who'd learned to navigate a world where justice was for sale and innocence was a luxury few could afford. So we're both carrying secrets that could get us killed, Calla said matter-of-factly. Appears so. Then we'd better make sure we're useful to each other. Over the next hour, they worked out the practical details of their arrangement. Ashgar would take her to his mountain cabin, where she'd be safe from the kind of predators that haunted places like Dead Mare Crossing. In return, she'd help him understand the changing dynamics of the territory and the specific players involved in the current corruption. Can you survive in the mountains? He asked. It's not an easy life, especially for someone who spent time in towns. I grew up on a ranch, Calla replied. I can ride, shoot, hunt, and take care of myself. What I can't do is survive much longer as a homeless woman in a place like this. And the marriage. How do we handle that part of the arrangement? We'll figure it out as we go, she said. Right now, survival is more important than social conventions. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they made their way back to the courthouse. Word of the evening's entertainment had spread throughout Dead Mare Crossing, and a considerable crowd had gathered to witness the unlikely wedding. Some faces showed genuine curiosity, others amusement, and a few displayed the kind of cruel anticipation that comes from watching other people's desperation. Judge Harlan had clearly spent the afternoon preparing for his performance. The courthouse had been decorated with wildflowers, and someone had provided a bottle of champagne for the post-ceremony celebration. The whole scene felt surreal to Ashgar, a theatrical production designed to mask the ugly realities of coercion and corruption. But as he stood beside Calla in front of the judge's makeshift altar, he realized something unexpected was happening. What had begun as a desperate gambit for survival was transforming into something that felt almost like hope. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't facing the future alone. And judging by the quiet determination in Calla's posture, she might be feeling something similar. Neither of them had any illusions about romance or traditional marriage. But they'd found something that might be more valuable. A partnership based on mutual respect, shared experience, and the understanding that sometimes the most unlikely alliances were also the strongest. As the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Judge Harlan called for order in his makeshift courtroom. The crowd that had gathered was larger than expected. Word of the unusual wedding had spread throughout Dead Mare Crossing and drawn spectators from the surrounding camps and settlements. Some had come for entertainment, others out of genuine curiosity about the mountain man and the homeless girl who'd agreed to save each other's lives. Ashgar stood before the judge wearing the same clothes he'd worn to his arrest, clean but well worn, leather and wool that spoke of a man who valued function over fashion. He'd made one addition to his appearance, a simple gold band that he carried in his shirt pocket, taken from a small leather pouch that held his few remaining personal possessions. Calla appeared at the courthouse door just as the last light began to fade, and the crowd's murmur died away as she entered. She transformed herself once again, this time into something approaching a traditional bride. Her auburn hair had been arranged in an elegant style that framed her face, and she wore a dress of deep blue wool that fit her perfectly despite its obvious age. Most remarkably, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect from even the most cynical observers. Where did she get that dress? Someone whispered. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house, came the reply. It was her own wedding dress from 30 years ago. She altered it this afternoon. The gesture said everything about how the town's women viewed this strange arrangement. Whatever their individual feelings about the circumstances, they'd rallied to ensure that Calla would not face this moment alone or unprepared. Judge Harlan cleared his throat and began the ceremony with his usual theatrical flair. Dearly beloved, he intoned, though his expression suggested he found the entire proceeding mildly ridiculous. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Ashgar Vane and Calla Rue in holy Matrimony, the words that followed, were standard territorial wedding. Vows, practical language focused on legal obligations and social responsibilities rather than romantic sentiment. But when Judge Harlan reached the portion requiring an exchange of rings, Ashgar surprised everyone by producing the simple gold band from his pocket. "This was my mother's," he said quietly, offering it to Calla. "She would have wanted it to go to someone who understood the value of making the best of difficult circumstances." Calla accepted the ring with hands that trembled, slightly the first sign of emotion she'd shown all day. As she slipped it onto her finger, Ashgar saw tears gathering in her eyes, though she maintained her composure. "Do you, Ashgar Vane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Ashgar replied, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "And do you, Calla Rue, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Calla met Ashgar's eyes as she answered, "I do. By the power vested in me by the territorial government, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The moment stretched awkwardly as the newlyweds faced each other. They'd discussed many practical matters during their afternoon conversation, but this particular detail had somehow been overlooked. Finally, Ashgar leaned forward and placed a gentle, respectful kiss on Calla's cheek, a gesture that somehow managed to be both appropriate to their circumstances and touching in its restraint. The crowd applauded, with more enthusiasm than either of them had expected, and several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even Judge Harlan seemed momentarily moved by what he'd witnessed, though he quickly recovered his theatrical demeanor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Ashgar Vane." What followed was an impromptu reception that neither Ashgar nor Calla had anticipated. Mrs. Patterson appeared with the promised champagne, along with a simple cake she'd somehow managed to bake during the afternoon. Other townspeople contributed what they could: wildflower bouquets, small gifts of practical items, and sincere wishes for happiness. Pete McCready approached them as the formal festivities began to wind down. "I've taken the liberty of preparing a wedding supper for you both," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it seemed like the right thing to do." The meal was served in the back room of McCready's store, away from the curious eyes of the remaining crowd. It consisted of venison stew, fresh bread, and preserves, simple fare that tasted better than anything either of them had eaten in months. "I need to ask you something," Calla said as they finished eating. "Earlier today, you could have chosen any woman in that courtroom. The merchant's wife would have brought you money and social standing. The saloon keeper would have been a practical choice for a man who valued independence. Why did you really choose me?" Ashgar considered his answer carefully. "Because you were the only person in that room who wasn't looking at me with either pity or calculation. You were just watching, thinking, evaluating the situation on its own merits. That told me you were someone who could handle whatever came next. And what do you think comes next?" "I think we head up to my cabin in the morning and figure out how to make this partnership work. I think Judge Harlan and his railroad friends are going to be watching us very carefully to see if we cause any trouble. And I think we're going to have to be smarter than they are if we want to survive what's coming." Calla nodded thoughtfully. "How long have you been planning to do something about the corruption here?" "I wasn't planning anything until today," Ashgar admitted. "I've spent 15 years trying to stay invisible, trying to avoid exactly the kind of situation we're now in the middle of. But seeing what they're doing to this town, to people like you and Pete and all those displaced families, it reminds me why I became a marshal in the first place. And now I think maybe it's time to stop running." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts about the dramatic changes the day had brought. As they prepared to leave McCready's store, Pete approached them with a wrapped bundle. "Wedding gift," he said gruffly. "Some supplies for your journey up the mountain. And this," he handed Ashgar a small leather journal. Belonged to a surveyor who passed through here last year. Thought you might find it interesting." Ashgar opened the journal and scanned the first few pages. What he saw made his blood run cold. Detailed maps of the entire territory, including precise locations of mineral deposits, water rights, and strategic transportation routes. Information that would be worth a fortune to the right people. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "Found it in the surveyor's belongings after he died. Official story was pneumonia, but he was healthy as a horse when he arrived. Started asking too many questions about who really owned what land and who had the legal authority to transfer titles." Pete's expression was grim. "His death was what convinced me that Judge Harlan's court wasn't interested in justice." Ashgar closed the journal and tucked it inside his coat. Another piece of evidence. Another reason why their new partnership might prove more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. As they walked back to the boarding house, Calla broke the silence. "So we're really going to do this? Live together, work together, probably fight together when the time comes. Appears so. I should warn you, I'm not the easiest person to live with. I have nightmares sometimes. I don't trust easily, and I have a temper when pushed too far. I've lived alone in the mountains for 15 years, Ashgar replied. "I'm probably not the easiest person to live with either, but I think we'll manage." They reached the boarding house as the last light faded. From the western sky, Mrs. Patterson had prepared a single room for them, an awkward necessity that neither had fully considered during their practical discussions. The room contained one bed, one chair, and a small washstand. "I'll take the floor," Ashgar said immediately. "We're both adults," Calla replied. "The bed is large enough for 2 people to share without impropriety. Besides, you'll need your rest if we're traveling to your cabin tomorrow." The arrangement was settled with the same practical efficiency that had characterized their entire relationship thus far. They prepared for sleep with careful attention to privacy and mutual respect. And when they finally lay down, Calla near the wall, Ashgar near the edge, with a careful space between them, both found themselves staring at the ceiling in the darkness. "Ashgar!" Calla's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes?" "Thank you. For choosing me, I mean. For giving me a chance at something better than slow starvation in this town. Thank you for saying yes. For trusting a stranger enough to tie your fate to his. We're not strangers anymore," she said softly. "Whatever else happens, we're partners now," as sleep finally claimed them both. Neither could have predicted how quickly that partnership would be tested, or how much they would come to depend on each other in the challenges ahead. But for the first time in months, Calla fell asleep without nightmares. And for the first time in years, Ashgar slept without the constant vigilance that had become second nature. Outside their window, Dead Mare Crossing settled into its own uneasy rest, unaware that the unusual wedding they'd witnessed was about to set in motion events that would change everything about their small corner of the territory. Judge Harlan sat in his office, composing a telegram to his superiors about the day's unexpected developments. And in the railroad office, other men were already making plans to ensure that Ashgar Vane and his new bride would not become the kind of problem that required permanent solutions. The game was in motion, and morning would bring the first real test of whether 2 damaged souls could find strength in their unlikely alliance. 3 weeks had passed since their wedding, and the mountain cabin had become something neither Ashgar nor Calla had expected. A home. The structure itself was modest but well built, constructed from hand-hewn logs and chinked with clay and moss. It sat in a natural clearing at 8,000 feet, protected by towering pines and overlooking a valley that stretched for miles without showing a single sign of human habitation. Ashgar had spent years perfecting the cabin's design for both comfort and survival. A stone chimney provided heat and cooking capability, while carefully positioned windows offered views of all approach routes. The roof was designed to shed snow efficiently, and the walls were thick enough to maintain warmth even during the harshest winter storms. Most importantly, the location was defensible. Only one practical approach existed, and that could be easily monitored from the cabin's main room. Calla had adapted to mountain life with a speed that surprised them both. Her ranch upbringing had provided a foundation of practical skills, but she'd thrown herself into learning the specific requirements of high altitude, survival with an intensity that spoke of someone who understood that knowledge was the difference between life and death. "Show me again how to read the cloud." "Formations," she said as they stood outside the cabin on a crisp morning, watching the weather patterns develop over the distant peaks. Ashgar pointed to a line of thin, wispy clouds that had appeared during the night. "Those are mare's tails. They usually appear 24 to 36 hours before a storm system arrives. See how they're moving from the southwest? That tells us the wind patterns at high altitude, which helps predict the storm's path." Calla studied the sky with the same focused attention she brought to all her lessons. "And those darker clouds building behind the ridge? Cumulus formation. Could turn into thunderstorms this afternoon, or they might just dissipate as the day warms up. The key is watching how quickly they're building and whether they start developing the anvil shape that indicates serious storm potential." She nodded, filing away the information with the dozens of other survival skills he'd been teaching her. In 3 weeks, she'd learned to identify edible plants, track game, read weather signs, and handle the tools necessary for mountain living. More impressively, she'd learned to think like someone whose life depended on accurate observation and careful planning. "Your turn," Ashgar said, handing her the hand-carved hunting knife he'd made specifically for her use. "Remember what I taught you about field dressing?" The deer had been taken the previous evening, a clean shot that demonstrated how quickly Calla had mastered the rifle. Now came the equally important skill of processing the meat efficiently and safely. Ashgar watched as she worked, noting the steady confidence of her movements and the way she'd internalized his lessons about waste nothing. "Use everything. You're a natural at this," he said, as she completed the task with minimal guidance. "Most people take months to develop that kind of efficiency. Most people haven't had my motivation," Calla replied, wiping the blade clean before returning it to its sheath. "When survival is the alternative to slow starvation, you tend to pay attention." Their conversations during these lessons had gradually revealed more about each other's backgrounds and philosophies. Calla had begun sharing stories about her family's ranch, not just the tragic end, but the good years when her parents had built something meaningful from nothing. Her father had been a man who believed in honest work and fair dealing, while her mother had possessed the kind of practical wisdom that kept a family fed and healthy through difficult times. "They would have liked you," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, gleaning the day's tools and preparing for another night. "My father always said you could judge a man's character by how he treated his animals and his tools. You take care of both with the kind of respect that speaks well of your nature." Ashgar felt an unexpected warmth at the compliment. "Your parents sound like they were good people. The kind who build communities instead of just taking from them." They were. Which is probably why they ended up dead when the mining company decided their land was worth more than their lives. It was the first time she'd spoken directly about her family's murder, and Ashgar recognized the trust inherent in the revelation. Their partnership had been built on practical necessity, but it was evolving into something deeper, a mutual respect based on shared values and complementary strengths. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked carefully. "Finding the men responsible?" "Every day," Calla admitted. "But revenge is a luxury I can't afford right now. Survival has to come first. Justice can wait until I'm strong enough to pursue it without getting myself killed in the process." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that didn't belong, the distant whinny of horses approaching through the forest. Ashgar was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, while Calla moved to the window that provided the best view of the approach trail. "3 riders," she whispered, "moving slowly, like they're not entirely sure of the route." Ashgar joined her at the window, studying the approaching figures through the gathering dusk. "They're not trying to be stealthy, which probably means they're not immediate threats. But anyone who found this place had to work hard to do it." The riders emerged into the clearing as the last light faded. 2 men and a woman, all showing signs of hard travel and desperate circumstances. Their clothes were patched and worn, their horses lean from poor feeding, and their postures spoke of people who'd been running from something for a long time. "Hello, the cabin," the lead rider called out. "We're looking for shelter for the night. We can pay for our keep." Ashgar stepped onto the porch, rifle held ready but not directly threatening. "This is private property. There's a town about 2 days' ride south if you're looking for lodging." "We can't go to Dead Mare Crossing," the woman replied. "Railroad men burned us out 3 days ago. We've got nowhere else to go." Calla appeared beside Ashgar, and he saw something in her expression that told him the decision had already been made. These were people like her parents had been, honest folks caught up in forces beyond their control, looking for nothing more than a chance to survive. "There's a lean-to behind the cabin where you can shelter your horses," Ashgar said finally. "We can spare some food and a warm place to sleep. But we need to know what kind of trouble you're bringing with you." Over the next hour, as their unexpected guests settled in around the fire, the story emerged. The Hendersons, for that was their name, had owned a small ranch in the valley below Dead Mare Crossing. When they'd refused to sell to the railroad company, Judge Harlan had declared their land grants invalid due to irregularities in the territorial filing process. When they'd attempted to appeal the decision, their barn had mysteriously burned down. When they'd still refused to leave, armed men had arrived in the night and torched their house. "We barely got out alive," Mrs. Henderson said, cradling a cup of Calla's coffee with hands that still shook from the memory. "They would have killed us if we'd stayed to fight." Ashgar and Calla exchanged glances across the fire. This was exactly the kind of situation they'd hoped to avoid, getting drawn into other people's conflicts with the railroad. But it was also exactly the kind of situation that made remaining neutral impossible for people with functioning consciences. "Where will you go now?" Calla asked. "We've got family in Colorado," Mr. Henderson replied, "if we can make it that far. But we're almost out of supplies, and winter's coming on fast." The moral complexity of the situation was clear to everyone around the fire. Helping the Hendersons meant accepting risks that could endanger everything Ashgar and Calla had built. But turning them away meant abandoning people whose only crime had been standing up to corporate corruption. "You can stay here for a few days," Ashgar said finally. "Rest your horses, resupply, and plan your route to Colorado. But you need to understand that we can't provide permanent sanctuary. We've got our own problems with the railroad, and getting involved in yours could be dangerous for all of us." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Thank you. We won't forget this kindness." As the Hendersons settled into the lean-to for the night, Ashgar and Calla found themselves facing their first real test as partners. The safety they'd built over the past 3 weeks was now threatened by their decision to help strangers. But both knew they'd made the only choice their consciences would allow. "We're going to have to be more careful now," Ashgar said, as they prepared for bed. "Word will spread that we're harboring refugees from railroad justice. That makes us targets." "I know," Calla replied, "but we couldn't turn them away. Not after what they've been through." "No," Ashgar agreed. "We couldn't, but we're going to need to start planning for what comes next. Because this won't be the last time we're forced to choose between safety and doing what's right." The Hendersons departed on the 3rd morning, well supplied and grateful, heading toward the Colorado border with carefully drawn maps and enough provisions to see them safely to their family. Their visit had changed something fundamental in the cabin's atmosphere. Not just the knowledge that their sanctuary could be found by others, but the realization that Ashgar and Calla could no longer pretend their problems were entirely their own. It was while cleaning the lean-to, after their guest's departure, that Calla made the discovery that would force them both to confront truths they'd been carefully avoiding. Hidden behind a loose board that had been disturbed during the Hendersons' stay was a small wooden box, wrapped in oiled cloth and carefully sealed against moisture. "Ashgar," she called, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that brought him immediately to her side. Inside the box was a faded tin-type photograph, its edges worn from handling, showing a woman and young girl posed formally in front of what appeared to be a simple frame house. The woman bore a strong resemblance to Ashgar, the same intelligent eyes, the same determined set to her jaw. The child, perhaps 8 years old, smiled with the innocent joy of someone who believed the world was fundamentally good and safe. Calla studied the photograph for a long moment before looking up at Ashgar's carefully controlled expression. "Your family?" "My wife Sarah and my daughter Emma," he said quietly. "That was taken about 6 months before they died." The pain in his voice was carefully contained, but unmistakable. Calla had learned to read the subtle signs of his emotional state over the past month, and she could see that this unexpected confrontation with his past had shaken him more deeply than he wanted to admit. "Tell me about them," she said gently, settling onto a log that served as makeshift seating. "Not how they died, but how they lived." Ashgar was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories that had been locked away for 15 years. "Sarah was the strongest person I ever knew. Not physically, she was small, delicate-looking, but she had the kind of inner strength that could weather any storm. She could take a household with no money and somehow make it feel wealthy. Could take a bad situation and find something in it worth laughing about." He sat down beside Calla, accepting the photograph when she handed it back to him. Emma was 8 when this was taken, curious about everything, fearless in the way that children are when they trust the adults around them to keep them safe. She wanted to be a teacher when she grew up, said she was going to build a school in every town that didn't have one. "They sound wonderful," Calla said, meaning it. "How did you meet Sarah?" "She was a school teacher in a little town called Cedar Falls. I was investigating a case involving fraudulent land claims, not so different from what's happening here in Dead Mare Crossing. The local sheriff was corrupt, working with a group of speculators to drive families off their land so it could be sold to railroad interests. The parallel to their current situation wasn't lost on either of them." Ashgar continued, lost now in memories that had been too painful to examine for years. Sarah was one of the few people in town brave enough to speak up about what was happening. She'd been documenting the illegal seizures, keeping records of which families had been forced out and under what circumstances. When I arrived to investigate, she provided the evidence I needed to build a case, and you fell in love. "It took about 2 weeks," Ashgar admitted with a slight smile. "She was brilliant, passionate about justice, and completely unafraid of men with badges and guns who thought they could intimidate her into silence. I'd never met anyone like her." Calla felt a complex mixture of emotions as she listened to his story. There was no jealousy. Sarah had been dead for 15 years, but there was a growing understanding of the kind of pain that had driven Ashgar into isolation. The loss of a great love was something that marked a person permanently. "What happened after you solved the case?" "We got married. I requested a transfer to a position that would keep me closer to home, and for almost 10 years we had something close to a perfect life." Sarah continued teaching. Emma grew up believing her father was a hero who fought for justice, and I foolishly thought I could keep them safe from the darker aspects of my work. The pain in his voice deepened, and Calla realized they were approaching the heart of the tragedy that had shaped the last 15 years of his life. The corruption case that ended everything. It was bigger than anything I'd encountered before. Railroad companies, territorial officials, federal land office administrators, even some people in Washington. Millions of dollars in fraudulent deals, thousands of families cheated out of their land and livelihoods. And you tried to expose it. I gathered evidence for 2 years. Testimonies, financial records, correspondence between the conspirators. I had enough to bring down the entire network, to send dozens of powerful men to prison and restore stolen land to its rightful owners. Ashgar's hands tightened on the photograph. But they found out what I was doing, And they realized that the best way to stop me wasn't to kill me. That might have made me a martyr, might have inspired others to continue the investigation. Instead, they decided to break me. Calla felt her stomach tighten as she began to understand where the story was leading. The cholera outbreak was real, Ashgar continued. But Sarah and Emma didn't die from disease. They were poisoned, something that mimicked cholera symptoms, but acted much faster. By the time I returned from what I thought was a routine investigation, they'd been dead for 3 days. The brutality of it took Calla's breath away. To murder a woman and child as leverage against a man who was simply trying to do his job. It spoke to a level of evil that she'd hoped existed only in nightmares. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to say them anyway, I found a letter in our house after the funeral. No signature, but the message was clear. This was the price of my investigation, and if I continued pursuing the case, more innocent people would die. People I cared about, people who'd helped me, anyone whose life touched mine in any meaningful way. So you disappeared. I destroyed all my evidence, staged my own death in a river crossing, and vanished into these mountains. I told myself I was honoring Sarah and Emma's memory by ensuring no one else would be hurt because of my crusade for justice. Calla was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the story, but its implications for their current situation. "And now you think the same people might be involved in what's happening here?" "I think corruption is like a cancer," Ashgar replied. "It spreads, it adapts, it finds new hosts when the old ones are destroyed. The specific people might be different, but the methods, the attitudes, the willingness to destroy lives for profit, that's all the same. Which means that by helping the Hendersons, by getting involved in Dead Mare Crossing's problems, we're potentially walking into the same kind of situation that got your family killed." "Yes." Calla studied his face, noting the way he held himself with careful control, the way his eyes had taken on the distant look of someone preparing for pain. "And you think I should leave? Find somewhere safer to go, distance myself from whatever's coming? I think you should know what you're risking by staying with me. I think you should understand that the people we're dealing with don't hesitate to hurt innocent people when it serves their purposes." Instead of the fear he'd expected to see in her expression, Calla showed something that looked almost like relief. "I've been waiting for you to tell me this story," she said. "I knew there was something you were holding back, something that explained why a man with your skills and experience had chosen to hide in the mountains, instead of fighting the corruption he obviously hated. And now that you know, now I understand why you've been so careful, so reluctant to get involved in other people's problems. But I also understand something else." She reached out and took his hand, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "The men who killed your family didn't just murder 2 innocent people. They turned one of the territory's most effective lawmen into a hermit. They removed someone who might have prevented dozens of other crimes, saved hundreds of other families from the kind of suffering the Hendersons are experiencing." Ashgar felt something shift inside him at her words. Not absolution, but a different way of understanding his choices over the past 15 years. Sarah and Emma wouldn't want their deaths to be used as an excuse for letting evil go unopposed, Calla continued. They'd want their memory to inspire justice, not justify surrender. You sound very certain about what dead people would want. I sound like someone who's learned that the dead don't rest easy when the living abandon the principles they died for, Calla replied. My parents didn't die so I could spend the rest of my life hiding from the people who killed them. And your family didn't die so you could spend the rest of your life letting other families suffer the same fate. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. Not painful, but clarifying, like cold water thrown on someone lost in fever dreams. For 15 years, he'd told himself that isolation was the price of honoring his family's memory. But Calla was right. True honor would require him to ensure that other families didn't suffer the same fate. So what are you proposing? He asked. I'm proposing that we stop running from who we used to be and start becoming who we need to be, Calla said. I'm proposing that we use the skills and knowledge we've both acquired to make sure that what happened to the Hendersons stops happening to other people. That's a dangerous path. Everything worth doing is dangerous. The question is whether we're going to let fear control our choices, or whether we're going to choose what's right regardless of the risks. As they sat together in the afternoon sun, the photograph of Sarah and Emma between them, both Ashgar and Calla realized they'd reached a turning point. The partnership that had begun as a mutual survival strategy was evolving into something much more significant, a shared commitment to justice that honored both their pasts and their hopes for the future. The ghosts of their dead families would always be with them. But perhaps it was time to let those ghosts inspire action rather than paralyze it. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Ashgar was checking his trap lines in the forest below the cabin, while Calla tended to their small garden and prepared supplies for the coming winter. The routine had become comfortable, even peaceful, and both had begun to believe that perhaps they could build a life removed from the corruption and violence that had driven them to seek refuge in each other's partnership. That illusion shattered at precisely 11 o'clock when the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed echoed through the mountain valleys. Calla heard them first and immediately moved to the cabin's most defensible position, the window that commanded a view of the approach trail. What she saw made her blood run cold. 8 mounted men moving with military precision, led by a figure she recognized from their brief encounter in McCready's store. Morrison, the railroad official who'd threatened Pete with building code violations, now rode at the head of what appeared to be a well-armed enforcement squad. She fired the warning shot they'd agreed. Upon 2 quick rifle rounds into the air, knowing that Ashgar would hear it and understand immediately that their sanctuary had been compromised. Then she began the careful process of preparing for a siege, gathering ammunition, securing water supplies, and positioning herself to defend the cabin's single entrance. Ashgar arrived at a dead run 15 minutes later, using the concealed approach route they'd scouted for exactly this kind of emergency. He reached the cabin's back wall just as Morrison's voice boomed across the clearing. "Ashgar Vane, we know you're in there. Come out peacefully and no one needs to get hurt." Inside the cabin, Ashgar and Calla crouched below the window line, weapons ready, minds racing through their limited options. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and had nowhere to run that wouldn't expose them to rifle fire from multiple directions. "How did they find us?" Calla whispered. "Doesn't matter now," Ashgar replied grimly. "What matters is getting out of this alive." Morrison's voice continued its theatrical performance. "We're prepared to be reasonable, Vane. All we want is a conversation. Surely a man of your experience understands the value of negotiation." The emphasis on experience sent a chill down Ashgar's spine. It suggested knowledge that went beyond his current identity as a simple mountain man. "We have something that belongs to you," Morrison called out, and this time his voice carried a note of cruel amusement. "Something you thought was lost forever." One of Morrison's men rode forward, carrying a leather satchel that he held high for anyone watching from the cabin to see. Even at a distance, Ashgar recognized it immediately. The official U.S. Marshal's badge and identification papers he'd thought were destroyed 15 years ago. "Ashgar Vane," Morrison continued, "former United States Marshal, wanted for desertion of duty and destruction of federal evidence. We know exactly who you are." The revelation hit Calla like a physical blow. Not because she was surprised that Ashgar had hidden parts of his past. She'd always known there were depths to his story that he hadn't shared, but because she understood immediately what this meant for both of them. "They've known all along," she breathed. "The trial, the wedding, bringing us together. It was all a setup." Ashgar's jaw tightened as the full scope of the trap became clear. "They wanted to flush me out of hiding. Everything that happened in Dead Mare Crossing was designed to force me into a position where I'd have to reveal myself or watch innocent people suffer. And I was the bait," Calla realized with growing horror. "They knew you'd choose me because I reminded you of Sarah, they knew you couldn't stand by and watch another innocent woman be destroyed by their corruption. Morrison's voice cut through their conversation. Marshal Vane, we have a proposition for you. Come out unarmed, and we'll discuss terms. Continue hiding, and we'll burn you out like the coward you've become. Ashgar moved to the window and carefully looked out at the assembled force. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. These weren't just hired thugs or corrupt local officials. The men surrounding his cabin moved with the precision of military veterans, carried quality weapons, and showed the kind of discipline that spoke of federal backing. They're not railroad men, he told Calla quietly. At least not entirely. Some of those faces are familiar, federal agents, probably from the same network I was investigating 15 years ago, which means this isn't just about land fraud in Dead Mare Crossing. No, this is about finishing what they started. When they killed Sarah and Emma, they thought I was dead. But when I surfaced here, they realized they had unfinished business. Morrison seemed to grow tired of waiting for a response. Perhaps you need more motivation, he called out. Bring up the old man. Two riders emerged from the tree line, dragging a third horse that carried a bound figure. Even at a distance, both Ashgar and Calla could see that it was Pete McCready, bloodied and barely conscious. We picked up your friend here this morning, Morrison announced. Seems he's been providing aid and comfort to federal fugitives. That's a serious crime, Marshal Vane. Punishable by death under territorial law. Calla felt sick as she watched Pete struggle weakly against his bonds. The old storekeeper had shown them nothing but kindness, and now he was paying the price for their friendship. Let him go. Ashgar shouted through the window. Your quarrel is with me. Our quarrel is with anyone who interferes with legitimate business interests. Morrison replied. You have 5 minutes to come out, or we start finding out how much blood one old man can lose before he stops talking. The threat was clear, brutal, and entirely believable. These men had already demonstrated their willingness to murder innocent people to achieve their goals. Pete's life hung in the balance, and both Ashgar and Calla knew that surrendering wouldn't save him. It would simply add 2 more bodies to the count. There's another way, Calla said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of desperate inspiration. What are you thinking? The surveyor's journal that Pete gave us. It contains proof of the illegal land seizures, the fraudulent titles, the whole network of corruption. If we could get that information to the territorial authorities— They control the territorial authorities, Ashgar interrupted. Morrison and his people have been planning this for years. They've bought judges, sheriffs, federal agents. That journal won't help us unless we can get it to someone completely outside their influence. Then we get it to someone outside the territory entirely. Someone in Denver or Santa Fe or Washington itself. Ashgar stared at her for a moment, then began to smile with grim appreciation. The telegraph office in Cedar Falls. It's 60 miles north of here, but it's outside Morrison's immediate control. If we could reach it, we could send copies of the journal's contents to every federal authority from here to Washington. Even Morrison's network couldn't suppress that much evidence sent to that many different people. It would mean leaving Pete to his fate. No, Calla said firmly. It would mean saving Pete and everyone else these people are planning to destroy. One old man's life weighed against hundreds of families. Pete would make the same choice we're making. Morrison's voice interrupted their planning. Time's up, Marshal. Last chance to save your friend's life. Instead of answering, Ashgar began moving toward the cabin's back wall, where their emergency supplies were stored. We go now, while they're focused on the front entrance. Use the concealed route through the pine grove, then circle north toward the ridge trail. What about our supplies? Our weapons? We take what we can carry and leave the rest. This cabin is compromised. We can never come back here. As they gathered their most essential items, the surveyor's journal, ammunition, basic survival gear, both realized they were abandoning more than just a physical shelter. The home they'd built together, the peaceful refuge where they'd learned to trust each other, the sanctuary where they'd planned to build a future, all of it was being sacrificed to a larger cause. Ready? Ashgar asked, checking his rifle one final time. "Ready," Calla replied. Though her voice carried the weight of everything they were leaving behind, they slipped out through the cabin's back wall just as Morrison's patience finally ran out. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood told them that the siege had become an assault, and they had perhaps minutes before their absence was discovered. Behind them, smoke began to rise from the cabin that had been their sanctuary. Ahead lay 60 miles of dangerous territory, hostile forces, and the slim hope that justice might still be possible in a world that seemed determined to reward corruption and punish integrity. But as they disappeared into the forest, moving with the skill and determination that had kept them alive through separate tragedies, both Ashgar and Calla knew they'd made the only choice their consciences would allow. The hunt had begun, but this time they weren't just prey. They were also predators, carrying information that could bring down an entire network of corruption if they could just survive long enough to use it. The cave Ashgar led them to was barely large enough for 2 people, hidden behind a waterfall that had carved a secret space into the mountain's granite face over thousands of years. The sound of falling water would mask their voices and movements, while the cave's position provided a commanding view of 3 different approach routes. It was, Calla realized, exactly the kind of refuge a man might prepare if he'd spent 15 years expecting his past to catch up with him. They'd been traveling for 8 hours since escaping the cabin, moving through terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers and leave most people dead from exhaustion or exposure. But both had pushed themselves beyond normal limits, driven by the knowledge that Morrison's men were somewhere behind them, and that Pete McCready's life, along with the lives of countless other innocent people, depended on their reaching Cedar Falls with the surveyors. "Evidence we can rest here for a few hours," Ashgar said as they settled into the cave's narrow confines. "But we'll need to keep moving at first light. Morrison will have trackers, and they'll be pushing hard to catch us before we can reach the telegraph office." Calla nodded, then began the methodical process of checking their supplies. The emergency pack Ashgar had prepared contained enough food for 3 days, ammunition for both rifles, basic medical supplies, and tools for surviving in hostile wilderness. More importantly, wrapped in oiled cloth and secured in a waterproof container, was the surveyor's journal that represented their only hope of exposing the corruption network. "Tell me about Cedar Falls," she said, as they shared a sparse meal of jerked meat and hardtack. "Who can we trust there?" "The telegraph operator is a man named Thomas Brighton. I worked with him during my marshal days. He's honest, competent, and has no love for corporate corruption. If anyone can help us get our message out, it's him. And if Morrison's people have gotten there first, then we improvise," Ashgar replied grimly. "But Cedar Falls is outside the immediate sphere of influence that Morrison's been building around Dead Mare Crossing. It would take time and resources to extend their control that far, and they might not have expected us to head in that direction." Calla studied the journal by lamplight, memorizing key passages and figures in case their physical evidence was lost or destroyed. What she read made her sick with anger. Detailed records of fraudulent land seizures, bribes paid to territorial officials, families driven into poverty or death by systematically corrupt legal proceedings. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving dozens of officials and affecting thousands of innocent people. "This goes back almost 10 years, she said. "They've been building this network since right after you disappeared. Almost like they learned from whatever investigation you were conducting and decided to be more systematic about their corruption." "They probably did learn from it," Ashgar admitted. "I was getting close to exposing something similar 15 years ago, but I focused too much on gathering perfect evidence and not enough on protecting the people helping me. This time, they've been more careful about eliminating witnesses and controlling the legal system from the beginning, which means they've had 15 years to perfect their methods for destroying anyone who threatens their operation. Yes, but it also means they've become overconfident. They think they've eliminated all the serious threats to their power, which is why they were willing to surface and try to capture me directly instead of just having me killed quietly. Calla considered this. So our best chance is to hit them before they realize how much evidence we have and how far we're willing to go to expose them. Exactly. Speed and surprise are our only advantages. Once Morrison realizes we're heading for Cedar Falls, he'll throw everything he has at stopping us. They spent the next hour planning their route and discussing contingencies. The terrain between their current position and Cedar Falls offered several possible paths, each with its own advantages and risks. The direct route would be fastest, but also most predictable. Alternative paths might provide better concealment, but would take longer and require crossing exposed terrain where they could be spotted by search parties. What about the old mining road? Calla suggested, studying Ashgar's hand-drawn map. It's longer, but it follows the ridgeline for most of the way. Better visibility of anyone trying to follow us, and harder for them to set up ambushes. Good thinking. The road was abandoned 5 years ago when the silver played out, but it's still passable for people on foot. More importantly, it connects to a secondary trail that comes into Cedar Falls from the east, away from any approach Morrison's people might be watching. As they refined their plans, both were acutely aware of the intimacy forced by their cramped hiding place. They'd been sleeping in the same room for weeks, but this was different. A shared vulnerability that stripped away the careful boundaries they'd maintained. There was no space for privacy, no possibility of retreat into individual solitude. "Are you frightened?" Calla asked during a quiet moment. "Terrified," Ashgar admitted. "Not of dying. I made peace with that possibility 15 years ago, but of failing again, of letting more innocent people pay the price for my mistakes. This isn't your mistake. You didn't create this corruption, and you didn't force Morrison to become a murderer. You're just the only person with the skill and knowledge to stop it." "Sarah used to say something similar," Ashgar said softly. "She believed that good people had an obligation to fight evil, regardless of the personal cost. She said that if you had the ability to help and chose not to, you became part of the problem." She was right. She was also dead at 34, because she believed that. Calla reached out and took his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the past month. "And how many people are alive today because she lived the way she did? How many children learned to read because she taught them? How many families kept their land because she documented the fraud being committed against them?" The question hung in the cave's close air, mixing with the sound of falling water and the distant call of night birds. Ashgar found himself thinking not just about Sarah's death, but about her life, the passion she'd brought to teaching, the courage she'd shown in confronting corruption, the love she'd poured into raising Emma to believe in justice and compassion. "I've been thinking about Emma too," he continued, "about what kind of woman she would have become if she'd lived. I think she would have been like you, strong enough to survive tragedy, brave enough to fight for others, smart enough to see through the lies that powerful people use to justify their cruelty. Tell me what she was like. Curious about everything. She wanted to know how things worked, why people made the choices they did, what made some people kind and others cruel. She read everything she could get her hands on, asked questions that made adults uncomfortable, and had this way of cutting through complicated explanations to find the simple truth underneath." Calla smiled in the lamplight. "She sounds like she would have made an excellent detective, or marshal," Ashgar agreed. "She had that combination of intelligence and moral courage that makes someone willing to stand up to bullies, regardless of how powerful they think they are." They fell into comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts about the people they'd loved and lost, the choices that had brought them to this moment, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Outside their hidden refuge, the night deepened and the temperature dropped, but inside the cave they were warm enough, dry enough, and, despite everything, oddly content. "Ashgar." Calla's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes? Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past weeks have been the happiest I've been since my family died. Not because of the circumstances, but because of the partnership we've built. Because of the way you've treated me as an equal, the way you've shared your knowledge and trusted me with your secrets. Calla, I need to say this, she interrupted gently, in case we don't get another chance. You saved my life in that courtroom, but more than that, you gave me back my sense of purpose. You reminded me that survival isn't enough, that living means fighting for something bigger than yourself. Ashgar felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cave's sheltered atmosphere. You did the same for me. You reminded me that hiding from evil doesn't make it go away, and that the best way to honor the dead is to protect the living. They moved closer together, not out of romantic impulse, but from a deeper need for human connection in the face of uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring danger, violence, and quite possibly death. But tonight, in their hidden sanctuary, they had each other and the shared knowledge that they were fighting for something worth the risk. We should try to sleep, Ashgar said finally. We'll need our strength for what's coming. I know, but I don't want to waste these hours unconscious. I want to remember this, being here with you, knowing that we're about to do something that matters. So they stayed awake, talking quietly about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, and their hopes for a future that might never come. They planned contingencies for their mission, shared stories about the people who'd shaped them, and gradually acknowledged the feelings that had been growing between them over the past month. It wasn't the dramatic declaration of love that filled romantic novels, but something deeper and more practical, the recognition that they'd found in each other not just a partner for survival, but a person whose values, courage, and character made them worth fighting beside, worth protecting, worth building a life with if they survived the trials ahead. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the first hints of rose and gold, both Ashgar and Calla knew they were facing the most dangerous day of their lives. But they also knew they were facing it together, armed not just with weapons and evidence, but with the unshakable conviction that some things were worth any risk. The battle for justice was about to begin, and they were ready. The telegraph office in Cedar Falls occupied a small frame building at the end of Main Street, its single wire stretching east toward civilization like a lifeline thrown across the wilderness. Thomas Brighton had been its operator for 12 years, and his small office had become the communication hub for every piece of legitimate business conducted in the northern territory. Ashgar and Calla reached the town's outskirts just as the morning sun cleared the eastern peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. They'd made good time on the abandoned mining road, but both knew that Morrison's trackers couldn't be far behind. The confrontation they'd been preparing for was about to begin. There, Ashgar pointed to the telegraph office. But look at the horses outside the sheriff's office. Calla followed his gaze and felt her heart sink. 6 horses stood hitched outside the building that housed Cedar Falls law enforcement, quality animals that didn't belong to local ranchers or merchants. They got here first, some of them did. But not all of them. I count 6 horses, and Morrison had at least 8 men yesterday. Either they split their forces, or some are still tracking us through the mountains. They studied the town from their concealed position behind a cluster of boulders. Cedar Falls was bigger than Dead Mare Crossing, but still small enough that strangers would be noticed immediately. The morning business was just beginning. Shopkeepers opening their stores, women heading to the market, children walking to school. We need a distraction, Calla said. Something that will draw Morrison's men away from the telegraph office long enough for us to get our message out. Ashgar was already thinking along the same lines. The livery stable. It's on the opposite end of town from the telegraph office, and it's full of hay and dry wood. A fire there would require every available man to help fight it, and give us cover to approach Brighton's office. They spent 20 minutes working their way around the town's perimeter, using drainage ditches and fence rows to stay concealed. The livery stable sat at Cedar Falls' western edge, conveniently isolated from other buildings, but close enough that smoke would be visible throughout the town. You sure about this? Calla asked as Ashgar prepared the materials they'd need. "We're talking about destroying someone's livelihood. We're talking about saving lives," Ashgar replied. "I'll make sure the owner is compensated if we survive this. But right now, that stable is the difference. Between exposing Morrison's network and watching more families like the Hendersons get destroyed." The fire started small, just a carefully placed bundle of dry grass touched off in an empty stall. But the autumn air was dry, and the stable's timber had been seasoned by years of mountain weather. Within minutes, flames were licking at the rafters, and smoke was pouring through the building's open doors. The response was immediate, and exactly what they'd hoped for. Shouts of "Fire!" echoed through the town as people ran toward the growing blaze. Most importantly, Ashgar saw 3 of Morrison's men emerge from the sheriff's office and join the bucket brigade that was forming to fight the flames. "Now," he said, and they moved toward the telegraph office, using the chaos as cover. Thomas Brighton looked up from his key as they burst through his office door, his face showing the kind of startled recognition that comes from seeing a dead man walk into your workplace. "Ashgar Vane," he breathed. "They said you'd been killed years ago." "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated," Ashgar replied grimly. "Tom, I need your help. People's lives depend on what happens in the next few minutes." Brighton's eyes flicked to Calla, taking in her obvious exhaustion and the weapons both carried. "What kind of trouble are you in?" "The kind that involves federal corruption, territorial land fraud, and multiple murders," Calla said, producing the surveyor's journal. "We have evidence that could bring down a network that's been operating for years, but we need to get it to people who can act on it." Brighton's expression hardened as he scanned the journal's contents. Like many frontier telegraph operators, he'd seen enough corruption to recognize the real thing when it was presented with documented proof. "Where do you want this sent?" he asked, moving to his equipment. "Denver Federal Marshal's Office, Santa Fe Territorial Government, the Interior Department in Washington. Anyone with the authority to investigate and prosecute." Brighton's fingers began flying over the telegraph key as Ashgar dictated the most damaging information from the journal. Names, dates, dollar amounts, specific legal violations. Evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic corruption involving railroad companies, territorial officials, and federal land agents. They were halfway through transmitting when the office door exploded inward. Morrison stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 of his men, all 3 with weapons drawn. His expensive suit was dusty from hard travel, and his face showed the kind of cold fury that comes from having carefully laid plans disrupted by unexpected opposition. "Step away from that equipment," he ordered. Brighton's hand never paused on the telegraph key. "Can't do that, friend. Official federal business in progress. There's nothing official about harboring federal fugitives and transmitting stolen documents." "These documents weren't stolen," Calla said firmly. "They were freely given by a citizen concerned about territorial corruption." Morrison's smile was arctic. "Miss Rue, you've become quite the troublemaker since your wedding day. Judge Harlan sends his regards, by the way. He's very disappointed that his entertainment didn't end as planned." The telegraph key continued its rapid clicking as Brighton worked to complete the transmission. Each dot and dash represented another piece of evidence being sent beyond Morrison's reach. Another chance that justice might prevail. "Stop that machine," Morrison ordered one of his men. "I wouldn't," Ashgar said quietly, his rifle now trained on Morrison's chest. "Tom's sending information to the federal government. Interfering with federal communications is a capital offense. So is impersonating a federal marshal," Morrison replied. "Which brings us to our current situation. You have something I need, and I have something you want." "And what's that?" "Your friend Pete McCready is still alive." "Barely, but alive. Surrender now, and I might be persuaded to let him live long enough to see a doctor." The choice was stark and brutal. Complete their mission and abandon Pete to a cruel death, or sacrifice everything they'd worked for to save one old man's life. Brighton's telegraph key fell silent as the transmission ended. "Message sent," he announced. "All of it." Morrison's face went white with rage. You've just signed death warrants for everyone in this room." The silence that followed Morrison's threat stretched like a wire under tension, broken only by the distant sounds of townspeople fighting the fire at the livery stable. 4 people stood in the small telegraph office, weapons drawn, knowing that the next few moments would determine not just their own fates, but the future of justice in the territory. Then Brighton's telegraph key began clicking again. Not outgoing messages this time, but incoming responses to the evidence they'd just transmitted. "Federal marshals dispatched from Denver," Brighton announced, reading the incoming Morse code. "Territorial governor ordering immediate investigation. Interior Department launching formal inquiry into land grant irregularities." Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, fury, and finally a cold calculation that was somehow more frightening than his earlier rage. "It doesn't matter," he said finally. "Evidence can be discredited. Witnesses can disappear. Federal marshals can meet with unfortunate accidents on mountain roads. Not this time," a new voice said from the office doorway. Everyone turned to see a man in his 50s wearing a silver star and the kind of weathered confidence that came from decades of enforcing law in hostile territory. Behind him stood 3 deputies, all armed and alert. "Sheriff Wade Hutchins," the man announced. "I've been tracking federal fugitives reported in this area, but it appears the fugitives I'm looking for aren't the ones I was told about." Morrison's hand moved toward his weapon, but Hutchins was faster, his revolver appearing with practiced ease. "I wouldn't do that, Mr. Morrison. Or should I say Mr. Marcus Webb of the Consolidated Territory Development Company." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Morrison Webb had been operating under a false identity, which meant his authority, his legal standing, and probably his entire operation were built on fraud. "Sheriff Hutchins," Ashgar said carefully. "I'm Ashgar Vane, former United States Marshal. Presumed dead for 15 years, Hutchins interrupted. "I know exactly who you are, Marshal. I was a deputy when you disappeared, and I've been wondering for years what really happened to you. Then you know why I had to disappear. I know you were investigating corruption that went all the way to Washington. I know your family was murdered to stop that investigation. And I know you've just transmitted evidence that's going to finish what you started 15 years ago." Webb's face had gone pale as he realized the scope of what was happening. "Sheriff, these people are federal fugitives." "I have warrants." "You have forgeries," Hutchins said firmly. "I received a telegram from the territorial governor 20 minutes ago. Your warrants have been revoked. Your authority has been suspended, and you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and multiple counts of murder." The arrest happened swiftly and professionally. Webb's men, realizing their situation was hopeless, surrendered without resistance. Within minutes, the telegraph office had been transformed from a battleground into something resembling a legitimate law enforcement operation. "How did you know?" Calla asked as Hutchins secured the prisoners. "I've been investigating unusual activity in this territory for months," the sheriff replied. "Too many people disappearing, too many legal irregularities, too much federal money changing hands without proper documentation. When I heard that a federal marshal had surfaced in Dead Mare Crossing, I started paying closer attention. And Pete McCready, safe and in custody. Webb's men had him in a cabin about 10 miles from here, but my deputies found him this morning. He's hurt, but he'll live." The relief Ashgar felt was overwhelming. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually survive this confrontation with their mission accomplished and their friends safe. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we wait for the federal marshals to arrive from Denver," Hutchins said. "They'll want statements from both of you. And Marshal Vane, there are some people in Washington who've been hoping for 15 years that you might still be alive. Your testimony could help prosecute cases that have been stalled for years." Brighton's telegraph continued clicking as more responses arrived from federal authorities. The evidence they'd transmitted was creating exactly the kind of firestorm Ashgar had hoped for. Multiple agencies launching investigations, Arrest warrants being issued, protective custody being arranged for witnesses. The network Webb was part of. How big is it? Calla asked. Bigger than anyone realized, Hutchins admitted, but also more vulnerable than they thought. They got overconfident, sloppy. Your evidence is connecting crimes across multiple territories, giving federal authorities the tools they need to dismantle the entire operation. Webb, now securely handcuffed, looked at Ashgar with undisguised hatred. You think this ends it? You think arresting a few middle managers will stop what we've built? I think, Ashgar replied calmly, that you've forgotten something important about corruption. It only works when honest people stay silent. But once they start talking, once they start providing evidence, the whole structure collapses pretty quickly. Besides, Calla added, we're not just talking about a few middle managers. We're talking about everyone in your network, from the territorial officials to the federal land agents to the railroad executives who've been financing this operation. Webb's expression suggested that perhaps he was beginning to understand the true scope of what they'd accomplished. Outside, the fire at the livery stable had been extinguished, and the town was returning to its normal rhythm. But Cedar Falls would be remembered as the place where a corrupt network spanning multiple territories finally met its match in the form of a former marshal who'd thought he was finished with law enforcement and a young woman who'd learned that sometimes the best way to honor the dead was to fight for the living. Justice had prevailed. But more importantly, it had been earned through courage, sacrifice, and the kind of partnership that reminded everyone involved why some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. 6 months later, autumn had returned to the mountains with its familiar palette of gold and crimson. But the world it painted was fundamentally different from the one Ashgar and Calla had known during their first desperate winter together. The corruption network that had controlled so much of the territory's economic and legal life had been systematically dismantled through federal investigations, trials, and the kind of justice that actually served people rather than corporate interests. Their new cabin sat in a valley 20 miles north of their original home, built with careful attention to both comfort and security. It was larger than the first. Room for guests, for meetings, for the kind of life that involved community rather than isolation. But it retained the practical design that had kept them safe during their months as fugitives, because both had learned that vigilance was the price of peace. Ashgar stood on the cabin's expanded porch, watching Calla work in their garden, while a group of displaced families set up temporary camps in the valley below. The Hendersons had returned from Colorado, reclaiming their land with clear titles and federal protection. Pete McCready had recovered from his injuries and moved his store to a new building in the town that was growing around their valley, a community built on honest business rather than corporate manipulation. The territorial governor's representative should be here soon, Calla called from the garden, where she was harvesting the last of their winter vegetables. Are you ready for another round of questions about federal law enforcement? Ashgar smiled at the question. Over the past 6 months, he'd been consulted on dozens of cases involving territorial corruption, land fraud, and corporate malfeasance. The federal government had offered him a full reinstatement as a U.S. Marshal, with back pay and a formal apology for the circumstances that had forced him into hiding. He'd politely declined the reinstatement, but accepted a consulting role that let him help with investigations, while maintaining the life he and Calla had built together. I'm ready, he replied, though I suspect today's meeting is more about the future than the past. The territorial governor had been pushing for Ashgar to take a more active role in reforming the territory's law enforcement system. With his experience, knowledge of corruption networks, and proven ability to work outside traditional power structures, he was uniquely qualified to help build something better than what had existed before. But Ashgar had learned the value of partnerships, and any decision about his future would be made with Calla's full involvement. She emerged from the garden, carrying a basket of vegetables, a movement showing the confidence and strength she'd developed during their time in the mountains. The frightened, desperate woman who'd sat in the corner of Macready's store had become someone who could face down armed criminals, navigate federal investigations, and help build a new community from nothing. The Hendersons sent word that their new barn is finished, she said, settling beside him on the porch. They want to hold a community celebration this weekend, dancing, food, proper recognition of everything that's changed. And what do you think about that? I think it's important to celebrate victories, especially when they've been earned through sacrifice and genuine courage. I think Sarah and Emma would have approved of what we've accomplished. The mention of his first family no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Calla had helped him understand that honoring their memory meant continuing the fight they'd supported, not abandoning it out of fear. Sarah's photograph now sat on their mantelpiece beside a picture of Calla's parents, a reminder that love didn't diminish when shared, but multiplied. "I've been thinking about the governor's offer," Ashgar said, "about taking a more formal role in territorial law enforcement. And I think it might be time to stop running from who I used to be. But only if you're willing to take that journey with me. Only if we can do it as partners." Calla was quiet for a moment, considering not just his words, but everything they represented. A return to public life would mean giving up some of the peaceful anonymity they'd built, accepting new risks and responsibilities, possibly making new enemies. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "I'm proposing that we accept the territorial appointment together. You have skills and insights that complement mine. You understand how corruption affects families and communities in ways that I sometimes miss. You've proven you can handle dangerous situations, gather intelligence, and make decisions under pressure. You're talking about making me some kind of deputy. I'm talking about making us partners in more than just marriage. Equal partners in building the kind of law, enforcement system that actually serves justice instead of corporate interests." The idea was revolutionary for its time. A woman serving as an equal partner in territorial law enforcement was almost unheard of. But then, their entire relationship had been built on revolutionary premises about equality, respect, and mutual support. "It would be dangerous," Calla said thoughtfully. "We'd be making enemies of powerful people who profit from corruption. We're already making those enemies. The question is whether we want to fight them from hiding or from a position where we can do the most good." A rider appeared on the valley. Trail, the territorial governor's representative, arriving for their scheduled meeting. But for the moment, Ashgar and Calla remained on their porch, two people who'd found each other in desperate circumstances and built something worth defending. "I accept," Calla said finally. "On one condition." "What's that?" "We build something that lasts beyond us. Something that doesn't depend on any individual to keep working. A system that can survive even if we can't." Ashgar nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Their partnership had taught them both that the most important victories were the ones that created lasting change, not just temporary solutions. The rider reached their cabin and dismounted, carrying official documents and the authority to reshape how justice worked in their territory. But the real authority, the moral foundation for whatever they built next, came from the choices they'd made over the past year, the trust they'd developed in each other, and the shared conviction that some things were worth any risk. As they prepared to meet with the governor's representative, both Ashgar and Calla knew they were about to embark on a new chapter of their lives together. The frightened mountain man and desperate homeless woman who'd married to escape death had become partners in every sense of the word, united not just by circumstances, but by love, respect, and a shared commitment to justice. Outside their window, the valley stretched toward distant mountains, where other communities were building honest lives on reclaimed land. Children played in yards that belonged to their families again, men worked fields they actually owned, and women could walk safely, knowing that the law served them rather than their oppressors. It wasn't a perfect world. There were still corrupt officials, still corporate schemes, still people who preferred profit to justice. But it was a better world than the one they'd inherited. And it was a world they'd helped create through courage, sacrifice, and the revolutionary idea that two damaged souls could find strength in partnership. Ashgar opened his journal. A new one. Started after the destruction of their first cabin, and wrote the day's entry. Sometimes a man's last choice becomes his first real chance to live. Today, Calla and I chose to build something that will outlast us both. The dead can rest now. The living have work to do. The territorial representative knocked on their door, and together they rose to answer it, ready to begin the next phase of their improbable partnership. Behind them, the afternoon sun painted their valley in shades of gold and promise, illuminating a future they would face as they had faced everything else, together as equals, with unshakable faith in each other and the possibility of justice in an often unjust world.